So I am delighted to start our second panel. In a slight change to the programme, Jean Rafter is going to actually go first. I've known Jean for a few years now. She is the Regional Manager in the Education Welfare Service in Tusla. She's been there for 14 years and she has a social work background, having previously worked with young people services in Focus in Ireland. Jean spent a number of years working in Romania and has a particular interest in working with children and families who have experienced marginalisation. So I'd like to thank Jean for coming. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start by saying that this might be where theory doesn't meet practice. So what I'm going to present on really is a local response to the opening of an emergency reception and orientation centre in the area, one of the areas that I cover in Kildare. I probably should have a subheading on it as in back to basics, because it's really about a local response of how people came together, particularly around the educational provision for the children who were going to be in that service. And also, I don't come from an education background. I come from, as Hilary said, social care, social work background. And our role in the Education Welfare Service is really about ensuring that every child has a school place or otherwise receives a minimum education. So we wouldn't really be reaching into the school around issues around curriculum and the inclusion of children in the school. I suppose it's more about how those children get to school and some of the barriers and some of the, I suppose, obstacles that we would see in terms of their education when they come into the country. So what I'm going to look at first is the background to the Hazel Emergency and Reception Orientation Centre, challenges and opportunities to the provision of education for the children who are in the centre. Then the resettlement of those children, because all of them, the plan was that all those children would spend 12 weeks in the Iraq, as we call it, and then they would move on to other local communities, and then they would need to be brought into the education system wherever they were moving to. Then the Hazel was redesignated in August of this year to a direct provision centre. I'm just going to highlight some of the differences in the work involved in that. And then I think it's the only piece that I have 2 slides on, which is the recommendations at the end that we would see as really important to support these children in education. So the Hazel operated as an EROC from August 2015 to August 2018, accommodating families under the Irish Refugee Protection Programme. So all the families coming to live in the Hazel, what was previously called the Hazel Hotel, so I'll just sort of refer to it as the Hazel, that was how it became known locally. All these families were from Syria. They were either coming from the Lebanon, refugee camps in the Lebanon, or they were coming through later about, I suppose, in 2017, 2018, some were coming through Greece. That's where they had made their own way there, and they were brought in from there. So over that period of time, there were 159 children of primary age and 66 young people of post-primary age came through the centre. And as I said, it was designated in August 2018. So we heard that the Iraq was opening a week before it opened. People were brought together, schools, people who had a brief around education, and we were asked, okay, so what do we do here? How do we provide education for these children? It was totally new to all of us. None of us had been involved in supporting children. And in fact, this was the first emergency reception and orientation centre that had opened in Ireland. So the premise was that these children and families would be about 12 weeks in the centre, and then they would be resettled into their local communities. So what we were looking at is, how do you, on an ongoing basis, provide education for children for 12-week blocks? And there'll be new families in, new children. You might have different compositions of families. You might have more post-primary children at one stage, you might have more primary children, or you might have more early years children. So it was really quite an unknown. So what was decided, it took some weeks to get thinking about this, I don't think anybody there sort of looked back at the theory around what was the best for these children, other than instinctively what can we do and what can we do locally to provide the best for these children. So what was decided that the under 5s would attend the local preschool. The children of primary school age were going to attend on-site classes operated by Kildare and Wicklow ETB, and the funding for that was going to come through the Department of Education and Skills. And I suppose some of the rationale behind that was some of these children may not have been in school before. There was also the provision in this way that school could go through holiday periods. So if we had children coming in May, for example, there would be some provision for them once they came into the country. And then as the only post-primary school in the area, Brian Bergen here was agreeable to taking in the children from the post-primary cohort. So in terms of the overall challenges we faced were, pretty obvious ones. The levels of English, it was a complete unknown as to what the level of English the children would have. Gaps in attendance at school, interrupted education. There were some children who came in over that time would have come from nomadic families, so some of their parents and some of them had never been in school before. Obvious huge differences in literacy, numeracy levels. And parents' understanding and expectations of the Irish school system. And I think for most people, the Irish school system is quite complex and convoluted. So parents coming in and wondering about, different types of schools, what age you should be in different schools, exemptions from Irish, all those sort of things they had absolutely no idea of. And there was almost a sense of something that I found very challenging about how much information do you give to families. You don't want to absolutely overwhelm them, but you also want them to be informed and making informed decisions. But for example, if, when we were going to the resettlement piece, if I went in with application forms for schools for another area, there would be things on the form like permission to take photographs when on school tours, lunch policies, all sorts of things that these families did not understand, and was almost, I felt, would be overloading and not right to get them to sign these things, because they would have, there was no problem, but I asked that those things would be done when the families moved to their new schools, because it almost seemed like really overwhelming for them. Even when I gave families application forms for the schools that they would move to, they would just, as you tried to explain about the school a bit, they would just go to the bit and say, where do I put my name? Because they wanted their children in education, but it was very difficult, and that was with interpretive services. We didn't know the level of trauma that either children or their parents or families had experienced. We were lucky in that we had somebody attached to the interagency group who was a senior psychologist and had particular knowledge around trauma, and was able to come in and talk to people who were involved in the Hazel and different providers around the country, the county, just to be able to brief us. But really, that was a very superficial understanding of the experience. Uncertainty around the length of stay in the Hazel, it was planned to be 12 weeks. There were some families who ended up there over a year. DES processes and circulars often don't fit the circumstances. So from our perspective, if we're going to support a parent to apply for a local school, it has to be in writing. We have to get a response within 21 days, and that decision can be appealed under Section 29 of the Education Act. But actually what we needed to do was build cooperation and build an openness for these children to go into school, rather than getting into any conflict. And also if schools maybe were in a position looking for extra resourcing or extra teachers, all that is quite cumbersome and quite prescriptive and didn't fit the situation we were dealing with. And as I said, the school admissions policies didn't fit what we were trying to do in the circumstances. So just looking at the primary classes, so the classes were set up in the Hazel. The emphasis was on ensuring that the children felt safe, and there was also a sense that having the classes for these children, so they were only from, like they were age 6 to 12, that, you know, at least the hotel, the building was familiar to them, so actually having them there for some period of time would they may feel more safe. The emphasis was introducing school returns, or school routines, taking turns, sitting at the tables, lunchtime play, etc. Many of the children hadn't been to school before, particularly the younger ones. Focus was on preparing for their school in their new area. So it was really like a transition to try and get them into ways and understanding the way the school ran, prioritising English language, and also the sense of they did like playtime and they did lunchtime so that it mirrored a class. These classes didn't have roll numbers, and that was quite a significant challenge in getting teachers, because the teachers, their work there wasn't acknowledged formally because it wasn't in a recognised school. No resources available, because without a roll number you can't apply for resources from the National Council for Special Ed, so SNAs or resource teachers can't be sourced. One of the things that was really important was when the children moved on to their new communities was that, you know, a report went with the child to the new school, so there was a sense of what level they were at, what their learning was, what level of learning they'd achieved. And I suppose at this stage, and I would say this was developed as, you know, it was really, how do we do this best? The idea really, I suppose, has taken on a bit that idea of the 12-week transition programme for these children is of value. And what's happening now is that, or what has happened is that there were 3 IROCs, one in Clonea, one in Ballahadreen, and the one in the Hazel that's now closed. The inspectorate from the Department of Education and NEPS, the National Educational Psychological Service, have gone in and looked at the teaching and learning and the setup of all those schools, and hopefully there will be you know, some sort of guidance and some sort of support around how we can develop these classes and give them maybe not roll numbers, but put them on a more formal footing and try and support them in the work that they're doing. So in terms of the opportunities that I feel that were there when the IROC opened in Kildare, there was already a Children and Young People Services Committee, which is a group of agencies, services, statutory, voluntary in an area that come together to try and work as collaboratively as possible. And it was interesting, in August 2015, we sat around the table at a regular Children and Young People Services Committee, and 5 people had previously been involved in offside things about the Hazel opening, but none of us as a group had been sort of put together and said, well, why not use the SIPSI as the vehicle for collaborative work in here, which we then, I suppose, adopted ourselves. We set up an interagency group under the SIPSI to work collaboratively. The commitment of individuals and their agencies was outstanding. It was really what made the work that we did successful. People stepped outside role, people did things that were not, you know, organising school buses, putting in proposals around trying to get youth services on board, trying to get funding for different things. So it was really, for me, the success, if it was successful, what we did, I suppose, was really influenced by the people involved, and that there was already that collaborative working approach under the SIPSI. The flexibility of the education providers, again, the local childcare committee really responsive to what needed to be done for the under 5s. Kildare, Wicklow, ETB, they were amazing in how they adapted, how they, you know, just went. I know, you know, of some of the staff that were going off at weekends trying to find school bags, trying to find pencil cases, all that really local initiative to try and keep it going. And obviously St. Paul's, who really went out of their way to welcome and include the post-primary children there. The eagerness of the children and young people and their parents, they just really wanted to be in school and they wanted their children educated, and that was really strong from the beginning. The availability of interpreters, that we could have interpreters whenever we needed, like when we knew groups of children going up to St. Paul's, we were able to get an interpreter. And at one stage, actually, there was somebody based in the Hazel that was an interpreter and who actually got to know the families and got it. That was really valuable, rather than just, I suppose, getting agency people in. Somebody who understood the families, the context they were living in, etc., was really helpful. For me, just reflections and learning on that piece around what we did in the Hazel was that all the young people and children got and participated in education. They were really keen to be in school. We'd no school attendance issues for the most part. Few maybe reluctant teenagers, but for the most part they were all in there and wanted to be there. There was a significant challenge for the primary school in merging, so you might have some children there who had been there already 5 months, and then you'd a new group arriving, and how the two of those groups could be accommodated. There was a second class developed at one stage when there was a large group, and it was that facilitated sort of a new cohort coming in. But then once numbers increased, you had that dilemma again. But a sort of accidental occurrence, which was the snow in, I don't know when it was, November 2017 or sometime, one of the groups that were there and due to move to another location, their housing wasn't available, and it looked like they were going to be there for another 6 months, which would have brought them up to about 1 year and 3 months in the centre. So we went to a local primary school and asked, is there any chance you could take in a group of children? But we don't know how long they're going to be here, and actually if you can take them, then if they leave, then we'll have other kids that we want to, which is quite a challenge for a school, as you can imagine, about, we have places in 5th class but not in 3rd, so all that sort of stuff. But something that I remember from that meeting was one of the people on the board of management, when we met them and they were really open to taking in the group of children, I just said at the end that, thanks for your openness, it's great. And the chair of the board of management said, no, thank you for this opportunity for our children. And I just thought that was really remarkable, that they, saw this as a great opportunity rather than, something they were doing under pressure. Really important. The impact of unplanned and sudden moves. I know Brian found this very difficult. You had, a child in school on a Friday and suddenly they were gone. They were moved. And while we absolutely understand that housing for the families was the priority and moving them to their settled areas, the links between the people doing that, I suppose, in the Department of Justice and ourselves really wasn't very good. And there should have been, I think, mechanisms whereby if I was sort of the link person, that if that was happening, that I was notified really as soon as possible, and then I could notify Brian in the school or the teachers in the primary school, because that, it's because people have built up relationships, they've really made efforts to include these children, and then suddenly they're gone. And also for the children just to be gone without really any warning in a day or two. The need for access to assessment and classroom supports, again, because they weren't recognised schools, no extra resources for the teachers teaching in those classes. And I suppose there was a sense in all, when you look at the Irish Refugee Resettlement Programme, is that we were all told to do this from our own resources, and there was nothing extra in terms of people or resources available. That's a challenge, because these children and families need more than other children and families in trying to support them into education. Need for broader inclusion measures to support. We tried to get stuff around youth services, sports, tried to get funding, tried to get people in to, because obviously all the children in the schools locally are participating in loads of activities, so we really felt that was something that we needed to, but all the time it was sort of fighting for money to get that sorted. Need to share knowledge and experience. There's 3 EROCs have been set up, very little communication between them to know, how did you do it, why did you do it that way, and really there's a body of knowledge now, and we'd be saying that that should be shared and built upon. Particularly around the education piece. And on a personal thing, I suppose for me, I would really love to hear the voices of the children and families, you know, and what has their experience been in terms of what was provided for them, what was good, what was bad, because I think that's how we learn how to improve what we want to do. And just the other thing, I suppose, that was really strong for me, as I used to go with the young people going up to St. Paul's to get their uniforms, and when they came out of the changing room in their uniforms, they were just like every other teenager, you know, these are too short, now I want a bigger one, and whatever, and immediately photographs being taken and sent to their families over, you know, in Germany or Syria or whatever, and it was really impactful, I suppose, to see that. In terms of the resettlement piece, so when the families were moving from the Hazel, housing as the primary driver for everything, so, you know, the delays, the sudden moves were all to do with the availability of housing. The importance of the local resettlement committees and interagency working. So, for example, in relation to our service, so if a family were moving to Donegal, the Education Welfare Service officer up there would get applications for the schools. They'd send them down to me. I'd go into the school, get them into the families, get them signed, send them back, all that. So there was really good collaboration in trying to get that sorted, and really significant challenges for schools in resettlement areas. So, you know, some of the stuff that was being spoken there about, you know, all the stuff we know about integrating these children and whatever, like schools in remote areas of Ireland, rural areas, they have no experience. A lot of them are taking in, you know, these children. They have not had children just from the local community before. So they need support, and they need, you know, some of this information and experience shared with them. So I suppose just the change from a resettlement programme where a lot of the services sort of reach into the centre and people are there and support the parents in doing what's needed. When it changed to a direct provision centre, one of the things is, you know, are there places in the local area? These, again, you know, how many children of that age? Jacinta, my colleague here, is the local education welfare officer in the area, and she went around, found out all the places that were available, you know, and it's really like a jigsaw trying to fit children into where places are available, then get transport. And again, schools without any experience really taking on. And now you're talking about children from all sorts of different backgrounds, different nationalities. No extra resources. Again, uncertainty regarding their length of stay. Uniform and book costs. It's unknown. Have these families got money? Have they not? Have they? How do they access? They can get a back to school grant, but if they come at different times of the year, is that available to them or not? Need for ongoing interpretive services. So, you know, it's really, in our view, it's really important that parents engage with schools. Obviously, they go to parent-teacher meetings, they build up that relationship. I think it was really strong from previous speaker about that home-school-home link. Without language, that's just not going to happen. And also mechanisms to include young people in local activities, like they really need to be involved in sports and dance and music and all the things that are available. So nearly done. So from my perspective, in terms of having been involved with the reception centre in Kildare, I think there's a real need for flexibility in enrolment policies in school, where the EROCs and direct provisions centres are, and in resettlement areas. So schools shouldn't be having to fight tooth and nail to have the right numbers, to get the extra teacher. There should be an openness to giving them extra because they are dealing with children that may have language issues or whatever. And in terms of supporting those children in school, again, a need for additional resources and supports. And sometimes that might be some of the things that people were talking about earlier, just the knowledge and what works with these children and what can help their inclusion in school. Dedicated access to the National Educational Psychological Service and National Council for Special Education Resources, almost, you know, that they're at the top of the list if something is needed locally, and that the services in those areas are given an allocation extra to support those the children from the asylum seeking and the refugee programs. Support for children. Trauma for us, completely unknown. I would imagine for schools it's not something they're expert with, but there are people who have expertise, and how can that be shared with the schools? Resources to include the children and all the local activities that go on in an area. Training for professionals and teachers to help support the young people. there's a lot of knowledge and experience out there, but it's not readily available, and it's almost like having a repository for all that information and having that available and accessible to teachers and schools. Because we're all, an EROC starts here, a direct provision starts here, a school here takes in children, but there's nowhere you can go to get, the best information. Guidance for the establishment of resettlement committees. There's a menu of who should be at the table, but there isn't really guidance about how those resettlement committees in an area work. I know in some areas, for example, the education welfare officer wasn't included and only heard, a week before the children were arriving, and no school places might be organised. And just the importance of developing best practice guidance for education for children in refugee and asylum processes, and that be really informed by the experiences of children and their family to date. That's it.